Moi! Tervetuloa Suomalaisuuden Liiton kanavalle. Minun nimeni on Juuso-Ville Gustafsson ja toimin Suomalaisuuden Liiton toiminnanjohtajana. Tänään minulla on vieraana kansainvälisesti tunnettu politiikantutkija ja kirjailija professori Matt Goodwin. Goodwin juontaa nykyään omaa ajankohtaisohjelmaansa Friday Night with Matt Goodwin GBnews-kanavalla. Goodwinilla on myös suosittu Substack-blogi, joka on kerännyt jo yli 84 000 tilaajaa. Ja sen löytää osoitteesta www.mattgoodwin.org. Matt esiintyi tänään myöhemmin Helsingissä Suomen perustan tilaisuudessa, jossa hän puhuu Britannian demografisesta muutoksesta. Ja onnistuimme saamaan hänet tänne myös meille haastateltavaksi. Matt hän vieraili liiton tapahtumassa jo viime vuonna. Hän kertoi tuolloin tuoreesta kirjastaan Values, Voice and Virtue, ja laitan linkin molempien tilaisuuksien tallenteisiin tämän videon kommentteihin. Tänään keskustelemme kuitenkin lyhyesti Britannian nykytilanteesta sekä Goodwinin tänä vuonna julkaistusta uudesta kirjasta Bad Education. Matt Goodwin, welcome to Finland.
Thank you for having me, and I one day hope to be able to speak Finnish, which listening to you is an incredibly difficult language.
Thank you. So how are you doing? What's going on with you?
I'm very good. I'm very busy because in case you've not noticed, my home country, the United Kingdom, is currently collapsing around us. So I've been very busy writing about that and trying to communicate to people about what's going on. But it may be that some of the things we discussed today have some obvious parallels with what's going on here in Finland.
They sure do. And on that note, let's just dive right in.
Sure.
I'd like to start off with a general question, because from the outside, it seems that Britain is really in serious trouble, as you say. You have a cost of living crisis, an ever-deepening poverty rates, according to your poverty survey 2025, an immigration crisis, a free speech crisis, and it seems that you are now heading toward an economic crisis of some sort. And we also keep hearing about rising political tensions and societal divisions, like you outlined in your book last year. We hear about two-tier policing, horrible rape gangs, non-crime hate incidents, and just draconian hate speech laws. And to top it all off, there are now some scholars like some scholars of war, like Professor David Betts, who has raised the alarm that Britain is showing all the signs of a nation on the brink of civil war. Matt, just what the hell is happening in Britain?
A nice, easy question to start with.
Yeah.
Well, Britain basically has lost its sense of identity, and it's no longer really sure I don't think we are sure as to what our national story is anymore. And by that, I mean, in order to make a nation state viable, you need a shared sense of identity, a shared sense of culture, a shared way of life, and a shared sense of collective memory. And almost all of those things currently are under attack, either deliberately, by design, or through sheer incompetence. And, just a brief survey, we have a political economy that doesn't work anymore. We have, almost zero growth. We have massive amounts of debt. We have massive amounts of borrowing, taxation's going up, the highest tax burden in our country pretty much since the Second World War. And we've got very expensive debt. We're paying about £110 billion every year just servicing our debt, just paying off the credit card. We then have a demographic crisis. So we have record levels of inward immigration. We've added close to 5 million people to our country in the last few years alone, most of those people coming from outside of Europe. Our birth rate is now at a record low of 1.4. We're not even replenishing ourselves, so we have a very pressing demographic crisis. We also have a political crisis in that levels of public trust in the institutions that govern our society are at record low levels. The people do not believe that established politicians are going to get us out of this mess. And look, I could sit here and list all of the problems, the free speech crisis as well, which you mentioned, in that we've become a very Orwellian society. with draconian hate laws and new definitions of Islamophobia to try and control what we can and cannot say. But at the root of all of this is one thing. At the root of all of this is a ruling class, an elite minority that represents at best 10 to 15% of the country, that is imposing on our country a set of policies, an ideology that the vast majority of people in our country do not support. And that is basically at the root of the crisis that our nation is facing. It's not to do with capitalism. It's not to do with, the evil far right. It's to do with the elite minority that for much of the last 30 years, pretty much from Tony Blair onwards, have ushered into our country a set of extreme public policies, and they are extreme policies. To give you just one, mass uncontrolled migration, open borders. These are extreme policies that have been imposed on the British people with no democratic consent. Nobody voted for this. Nobody wants this, yet they've still been imposed on the people top down. So that is what is at the root of our crisis. That is what links everything together. And from that flow many problems that we can get into in more detail.
Is this specific to the United Kingdom, or is this something that's happening in other European countries?
No, I think everybody will recognize what I'm talking about, because this is largely a Western phenomenon, potentially global. We're talking about the rise of a highly educated, university-educated elite class, lives in the cities, leans to the left. Even so-called conservatives are part of this elite class. Liberal conservatives who aren't really conservatives at all. They tend to embrace social liberalism, if not radical woke progressivism. They have embraced what the English philosopher Roger Scruton once called the culture of repudiation. So they are invested in repudiating their own country and in repudiating their own culture, not because of healthy self-criticism, because we should all welcome healthy self-criticism.
Definitely.
But because of self-hatred, because they essentially have absorbed an ideology that leads them to deconstruct all of the things that underpin our Western civilization. And whether knowingly or not, that ideology they have then pushed into our institutions, state media, secondary schools, primary schools, even the Church of England, this culture of repudiation that we should be ashamed and embarrassed of who we are. Now, the people in the UK and Britain and England are saying very loudly, well, we reject this, because there are three things going on that I think would be of interest to people in Finland. Number one, we are living through a political realignment with Nigel Farage and the Reform Party now topping the polls, somewhat similar to some parties here in Finland. Number two, we have had street protests across the country for much of the summer, with people taking to the streets peacefully, but saying to the government, we reject your policies of broken borders and mass uncontrolled immigration. And number three, we have a spontaneous social movement, a campaign which is called Raising the Colours, where people have been spontaneously, organically putting up Union and St. George's flags on lampposts, public buildings, and even painting roundabouts in the colours of the national flags as an act of resistance, against a political establishment they feel no longer represents them, nor even respects them. And that's the crucial point.
That's really sad to hear, because I've always had a fondness for Britain, for the people, the culture, the way it keeps producing great authors and scholars who are willing to stand up for traditional liberal values like free speech and to defend what we would call common sense, however vague both of these concepts nowadays are. I often turn to British writers and thinkers, yourself included, for ideas and inspirations. I look up to their intellectual courage, your intellectual courage, and this is also why it was a bit depressing reading your latest book published earlier this year called Bad Education, Why Our Universities Are Broken and How We Can Fix Them. I read your book and felt it had two sides to it. On the one hand, I saw it as a very personal story that of someone who truly believed, or perhaps still believes, in the academic ideals, but who gradually grew disillusioned and was badly let down by university life. As a story of unfairness, of the deepening political and economic pressures within academia, as a story of someone who genuinely cared about teaching, who took it seriously, who once admired the institutions, and who I would imagine has sacrificed so much for and also achieved so much within it, only to watch it change into something so broken that it led you to give up your professorship. On the other hand, I read it as a structured critique of the changes that have taken place in universities in the UK during your time, as a critique of the changes in scholarly life, a critique of how students and the student culture has changed, and a critique of the whole system. So Matt, Professor Goodwin, what happened to Britain's universities?
Well, the short answer is, like universities in large parts of the Western world, they've completely lost their way. I started teaching in 2004. I spent 20 years in higher education, teaching, researching as a lecturer, and then rising to become a professor. And I reached the point in my life where I realized I didn't want to devote the rest of my life to institutions that have become completely adrift from what they're supposed to do, from their original purpose. You know, yes, universities in the early days were religious institutions, but there was a point where they morphed into institutions that understood that they were there to pursue truth, that they were there to pursue truth through scientific inquiry, that they were there to value debate and discussion, and to expose students to a range of ideas and beliefs.
Yes.
What I saw over the 20 years were institutions that became the opposite of that, openly political, imposing political criteria on pretty much every aspect of university life, from applying for research grants to applying for jobs. You cannot, in the UK, apply for major research grants or major positions and jobs and so on, unless you swear allegiance to the diversity, equity and inclusion agenda, or DEI, which is a political agenda.
Yes.
So the litmus test is imposed early on. And if you can't get a grant and you can't get a job, you can't rise up in academia. So the whole system is rigged. And I saw this firsthand. You know, I've sat in the hiring committees. I've sat in the discussions. Well, you know, I think we really need a person of colour. Well, you know, isn't that person conservative? Wink, wink. I've sat in those rooms, okay? I've seen it.
Yeah.
And over 20 years, the people I felt most sorry for, increasingly, were not my colleagues, who had sort of, many of whom, you know, sort of morphed into hyper-political activists, kind of losing sight of the fact they're in taxpayer-funded institutions. The people I felt most sorry for were the students and their families, because they were paying and are paying an enormous amount of money to go into institutions and support institutions that they think are there to pursue their original purpose, but which are often really doing those students a disservice by becoming so openly political. And I just reached a point. I said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I would rather leave the universities and enter the public debate as it sounds very arrogant, but as a sort of more public intellectual, than stay in these institutions that have lost their way, because I don't see how those two, I don't see how those two can be done the same. Now, my colleagues on the left don't think that way. They think you can stay in the universities and be an activist. That's fine. I always saw a tension. I said, okay, if I'm going to become more political and outspoken, then I need to leave the universities, because that is what academic freedom is about. That's what academia should be about. Now, my colleagues on the left don't think that way. You know, people who are saying, well, I'm a proud communist, and almost trying to indoctrinate students. That's not what universities are here to do. It's not what they should be doing. And I left. And someone said to me, actually, a couple of weeks ago, they said, don't you miss the universities? And in that moment, I realized I hadn't once thought about the universities at all.
maybe you are finally free from those institutions, at least partly, because you have a visiting professorship at the University of Buckingham. Am I right?
Yeah, so we have an institution in the UK which is led by Eric Kaufman, who many people will know. He's a famous political scientist. He's worked on demography and populism, and Eric has set up the Centre for Heterodox Social Science, which is trying to do what universities should all be doing, which is exploring research questions from a diverse array of perspectives. And he's just had the inaugural conference, had Steven Pinker, among many other people coming along. But crucially, it has started to look at things like woke ideology, radical leftism, demographic change, all of these things that you would think should be part of university life. I mean, whatever you think about the woke, whether you think they're good or bad, you can't deny this is one of the most significant social movements of our time, especially over the last 15 years. Yet no university, to my knowledge, has actually got a dedicated course on studying woke ideology, which Buckingham now has. In fact, we just had a handbook published on left-wing extremism in the social sciences, which begins by saying, and this is, 2024, I think, it's one of the first lines is, it's strange to write this, but I believe this is the first dedicated handbook on left-wing extremism in the social sciences, despite 70 years of endless amounts of work on the far right and, right-wing populism. I used to work on parts of that literature, 20 years ago. So the bias and the imbalance is overwhelming. And what Eric has tried to do, and I've said I've tried to help him with it, is we've just tried to inject a little bit of common sense and a little bit of political balance into a sector that is hideously rigged.
In your book, you also do give some hope that universities might still be reformed. And you present a list of commitments they should make if they want to provide a good education instead of a bad education. I won't read the list here. The listeners can find it in the book. But let me ask, if you had to pick 3 of the most important commitments, which would they be?
Firstly, a commitment to the principle of viewpoint diversity, right? Now, I resent using the words diversity, but, it's the only way that you'll get any academics and university bureaucrats to take notice. But if you are so obsessed with racial, gender, and sexual diversity, then let's embed viewpoint diversity in there. Let's ensure that faculty are ideologically diverse. Let's ensure that reading lists are ideologically diverse. Let's ensure that the speakers on campus are ideologically diverse, because I, like many of my students, and my students would come up to me after class and say how sick and tired they were of being in what they described as a monoculture, a very narrow, a very closed-minded institution, not an open-minded one where, an array of ideas should flourish. So that would definitely be one. I'd remove these diversity statements from job applications and research grants, which are used to basically weed out gender-critical scholars and conservatives. And I would force universities, if I were ever Prime Minister of the UK, which would make many people shudder, but my Substack readers and I would be delighted. We would force all universities to sign up to the Chicago Principles, and you can get them online. It's about returning universities to what they're supposed to be about: neutrality, balance, the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of the scientific method. Because the examples I give in that book, dozens of scholars who have pursued politically incorrect questions or have found politically incorrect findings, who have then been shunned simply because of politics. Now, that to me should not be happening in any university.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. Okay, so we've more or less established that Britain is broken and its universities are broken too. But we can't stop here. I know you care deeply about your country, as do many others around the world. We all want the Britain of Monty Python, the Beatles, Shakespeare, James Bond, take your pick, to live on. So let's bring this all together and then kind of look ahead. Now, we've spoken about the decline, both in UK and its universities, but there is also pushback that you mentioned. Grassroots movements, political opposition like the rise of reform, and a strong will among many to take back their country. And to me, that points to something hopeful. So, Matt, can Britain actually be fixed? And if so, what are a few key steps that would make the biggest difference?
Well, for the first time in a very long time, I am actually optimistic about the future of my country because of the political and social changes that we are now witnessing. The way I view this, I view the UK, Britain, England as, being between two regimes. The first regime basically began in 1997 with the election of Tony Blair and is now coming to an end with Keir Starmer's very unpopular and very incompetent Labour government. This regime is one that you might loosely call socially and economically liberal with tinges of radical progressivism, okay? And that regime has completely reshaped the constitutional, social and demographic makeup of our country in about 30 years. And it's done that by imposing mass immigration, by changing the constitutional settlement, by embedding two-tier bias policies into key institutions, in mainstreaming the equalities agenda, in allowing wokeism in through the back door. And it's done a bunch of things, I won't bore viewers with the detail, but they can find me on social media where I talk about it endlessly. That's regime one.
Okay.
We're in the middle between that and what I would call regime two.
Okay.
Regime two is going to be about pushing the pendulum back to represent popular sovereignty, away from an elite minority and reasserting the voice of the forgotten majority. Or to put it in Roger Scruton's language, it's not going to be about the culture of repudiation anymore. It's going to be about the culture of affirmation. We believe in Britain. We believe in the greatness of our country. We believe that we have created, our ancestors have created, one of the most unique, prosperous, and special cultures and civilizations the world has ever known. We're not afraid to say that. We are proud of it. We embrace it. We now need to build a settlement, a new settlement that reflects that. What does that mean? It means we need a clear out of regime one. So we need an entirely new political force in power. I suspect that will be Nigel Farage and the Reform Party as a conduit to getting to that.
Okay.
As an important part of that. We then need to bring into place policies that are going to overturn the status quo of the last 30 years. What does that mean? We need to overturn the Blairite revolution. We need to overturn the legislative and policy foundations of regime one. We need to end immediately mass uncontrolled immigration. We need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, which prevents us from being a sovereign, self-governing nation that can control our own borders and can deport foreign criminals. We need to reform, if not repeal, Tony Blair's Human Rights Act, which entrenches the ECHR into domestic law. And we need to root out two-tier policies from our institutions. In fact, we really need to take off the top layer of our society and completely reconfigure the elite class so that true power and true authority and true legitimacy resides not with an elite minority that represents at best 10% of the country, but that power is sent back to the people who represent a good 80 to 90% of the country. So there's a whole host of radical policies that need to be pursued. The elite class have been very, very clever. They've built a system that works for them. They've built policies that represent their values and their voice. But they've done so at the expense of the hard-working, tax-paying, law-abiding majority who are playing by the rules. And, people often say to me, well, what is Britishness? What is Englishness? I always say there's one word: fairness. One thing we expect is everybody plays by the rules. It's not abstract. It's almost sacrosanct. It's a sense that we play by the rules. We expect other people to play by the rules. And on a daily basis at the moment, that British sense of fairness is being violated by illegal migrants who are breaking our laws and being given preference in the housing market or the welfare state, is being broken by predatory capitalists who are exploiting British workers, by hyper-globalists who are exploiting British workers, and by a hapless political class that would rather have the best part of 10 million Brits sitting on welfare while flooding the economy with cheap migrant labour than actually make the tough decisions that are needed, which is we're going to stop all of this cheap migrant labour, which is also undermining our culture and eroding who we are, and we're going to get our people back to work. We're going to give them a sense of meaning and dignity in their lives, and we're going to build an economy that actually works for British and English people. We are, in other words, going to embed a principle of national preference. Our people come first. That is the fundamental principle that holds an entire nation state together. Even the Roman statesmen back in the day understood this. They called it the first duty of governance. If you do not look after your own people, your civilization will collapse because it will become weak and it will become open to external invaders. That is exactly what is happening in the UK, in Britain and England right now. So regime 2 is about wholesale radical change, saying we're not going to put up with this anymore, and we're going to mobilize openly and willingly popular sovereignty to push back against this elite class, much like we did with Brexit. Brexit was the trailer. Brexit was the trailer for what is coming. Now watch the full movie.
Well said. I have to ask, have you ever considered standing as a candidate in the next UK general election?
You have to wait and see.
Okay. I look forward to finding out. Finally, if you were put in charge for one day and could make just one change to set Britain back on track, what would it be? 3
words. End mass immigration. End mass immigration. Now let me just say why. Economically, it makes no sense. 0 sense. Let me just say this to anybody who violently disagrees with everything I've said. People on the left used to understand the importance of evidence and information. Mm-hmm. And they love this word, misinformation. If you oppose our policies, that's misinformation. Let's talk about the information. The evidence on the effects of migration on Western economies is now overwhelming. We have studies in the Netherlands, we have studies in Denmark, we have studies in Finland, we have studies in the UK that all show the same thing. If you have a large amount of migration from outside of Europe that is mainly low skill, low wage, low levels of education, it is a net fiscal cost to your economy. In other words, it takes more out than it puts in. Who picks up the cost? Taxpayers. Taxpayers from these countries who are now increasingly aware that they are paying the cost. They are subsidizing mass migration. Economically, makes no sense. In the UK, even the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is part of the blob, now accepts that every low-wage, low-skill migrant that comes into Britain from Africa, the Middle East and elsewhere costs, on average, each one, costs on average between £150,000 and £1 million over the course of their lifetime. So economically, mass immigration doesn't make much sense. Culturally, it makes 0 sense because the kind of migration we now have coming into Europe is non-European. Much of it is coming, like in the UK, 81% of all migration is coming from outside of Europe. Pakistan, Nigeria, China, Uzbekistan, and so on and so on. Here's the question I would ask the left. How on earth can you build a viable, sustainable nation state when you are importing not just culturally different people, but culturally incompatible people? How do you build a unified nation state? There's a very interesting book recently by an academic called Garrett Jones who talks about the risks that come with migration from a cultural perspective. Yeah. And he says that sometimes importing cultures can have positive effects. Think about the British, when we ran around the world and we had the days of empire. One thing actually that we did well is we left a lot of places with superior administration and governance. The Spanish and the Portuguese, argues Jones, left very different structures, and it didn't really work because when you transferred their cultural practices onto some of these countries, they were left with more inefficient governance arrangements. What we are doing now in Europe is we are transferring in inferior cultures that are often diametrically opposed to Western values and Western traditions. Now, we've seen that most graphically in the UK with the rape gangs, where we have imported cultures from rural Pakistan, Kashmir to be specific, clan networks that have come to the conclusion, partly through culture and religion, that it is acceptable to mass rape and sexually assault non-Muslim, white, vulnerable girls, and then to laugh at the UK legal system when they are arrested and sent to jail because they don't really rate the legal system. That is a very good example of how the transfer of cultures can go disastrously wrong. So mass migration culturally can be a complete disaster. And just lastly, I could sit here and talk to you about the evidence around the housing crisis, the evidence around infrastructure. I could go into all of the evidence on that. But socially, it's about the social contract, because what we are doing in Europe now is we are encouraging the hard-working, tax-paying, law-abiding majority to withdraw from the social contract. You might have seen the meme of Nick, 30 years old, who's a young guy. I think it started in France, so then morphed to the UK. He's a young guy. It's a meme. He's 30. He's doing everything the system is asking him to do. He's going to work. He's paying his taxes. You know, he's just trying to build a future for his family. He's just trying to get on in life. But the social contract is pummeling Nick to death. I mean, he is paying for migrants to sit on the welfare state. You know, he's paying for baby boomers who lucked out from the expansion of property and final salary pensions. You know, he is subsidizing, Hamas terrorists in social housing in the UK. You know, he's subsidizing people who are breaking our laws by arriving on small boats, and we are then putting them in luxury hotels. That's and then insane. Wondering why more people are coming over on the small boats. Socially, mass migration is undermining the social contract. Why would you support that social contract longer term? Why would you not look around and think, you know what? I'm going to Dubai, right? I'm moving. I'm going somewhere else. This doesn't work for me and my family anymore. And I think that is one of the big things that underpins all of this, because there are some of us who can see where this is headed. You know, by 2063, white Brits will be a minority in the country, not just London. By the 2070s, people born outside the UK and their immediate children will be a majority. And by 2100, 1 in 4 people in the UK, 1 in 3 of the under 40s will be following Islam. These are based on credible forecasts drawing on government data. Okay? So if we do not change track now, I think the social contract in the UK will collapse. And the flip side of that, the other side of that, is civil unrest, is violence, is all of the things that ironically 70 years ago academics said the British never did, because we were the civic culture. We were not like Germany, we were not like Italy, we weren't like France. We didn't take to the streets. We didn't do political extremism. We didn't get angry. You know, the angriest the Brits would get is arguing with their neighbour about, you know, the garden fence. That was basically it. But now we're being turned into a restless country, and we're being turned into an angry country because of these very deliberate policies, very extreme policies. And that is why I say, if you want to do one thing, if you want to turn this around, you wake up tomorrow, new government, big majority, as Nigel Farage has said he's going to do. End mass uncontrolled immigration. End it now.
Matt, Professor Goodwin, thank you very much for this interview. Siinä oli haastattelumme tällä kerralla. Kiitos kun kuuntelit. Muista tykätä videosta ja ottaa kanava seurantaan.